that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Actions may only be the beginning. Thank you and good night.
On October 22, 1962, U.S. President John F. Kennedy delivered what might have been the scariest speech of all time. At that moment, Kennedy put the lives of millions of people at risk with the push of a button. But what sparked all the controversy and put the US and Soviet Union on the verge of a third world war? Let's find out. Hey US history fans, and welcome back to Yero's History Channel. In order to get started today, we must backtrack to 1823. In 1823, 5th President James Monroe warned Europe with the Monroe Doctrine to basically stay away from the Western Hemisphere in an attempt to claim it as their own. Fast forward to the Spanish-American War, and the United States and Cuba had remained rocky relations ever since the 1898 Treaty of Paris ended the war and forced Spain to surrender Cuba. Though Cuba was deemed an independent nation, President William McKinley introduced the Platt Amendment, which allowed U.S. intervention in Cuban affairs. For the next 50 years, the Cuban people lived under American imperialism. The U.S. controlled their trade, foreign policy, and their economics, which ended up setting the context for the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fast forward to 1959, after 60 years of imperialism, the government of Cuba, which is a nationalistic government under Batista, is overthrown by the revolutionary, communist guerrilla of Fidel Castro. Castro goes on to make an alliance with Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. It's also important to remember that at this time, the Cold War was ongoing, so that provoked a lot of fear in the United States, now that the enemy, Russia, was 90 miles from the shore of Florida, which violated the Monroe Doctrine. In 1959, Republican President Dwight Eisenhower puts together a CIA plan which is known as the Bay of Pigs, which was designed to use trained Cuban exiles that were Cuban to send them back with American support in order to overthrow Castro and revive the Monroe Doctrine. However, before the Bay of Pigs is able to go through, President John F. Kennedy is elected. Not knowing much about it, JFK is pressured to go with the plan, which ended up being a massive disaster and humiliation. JFK also authorized another CIA program called Operation Mongoose, which was an attempt to kill Fidel Castro. When Castro and the Soviet Union find out, they decide to put nukes on the island. The move is more of a jab at Kennedy, who was looked at as a weak link by Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, as JFK didn't back up the Cuban exiles from the Bay of Pigs. In the summer of 1962, Khrushchev begins to install ICBMs, which are known as intercontinental ballistic missiles, right in the backyard of the United States. So before we head into the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have to learn about MAD, which stands for Mutual Assured Destruction. With this policy, nobody is willing to press the buttons to use nuclear wars, which would prevent the deaths of millions and possibly a world war. So from October 15th to the 28th, also called 13 Days on October, the United States discovered the Cuban missile sites. An American U-2, not the band, reconnaissance plane takes snapshots and discovers that the Soviet Union is putting missiles in Cuba. With the ongoing tension, JFK is forced to react immediately. His first reaction was to immediately invade the island, with good reasoning, as not only was the site so close to the US soil, but Kennedy had generals underneath him, such as General Curtis LeMay, who was the commander of the Enola Gay and dropped the bombs in Hiroshima, yelling for invasion in Cuba. Credentialed voices around Kennedy were pushing the need to invade, as the US could not allow the Soviet Union to put missiles in Cuba, effectively throwing away mutual assured destruction, as the US wouldn't have enough time to react to an attack.
However, the US also had missiles in Turkey, so the Soviets used that as a counter, saying that they were just mirroring what the US was doing.
The US were on the brink of invading Cuba, but in one of their last meetings before doing as such, former foreign ambassador to Moscow, Tommy Thompson, made a statement that would change it all. He said that if they were to invade, they would be pushing Khrushchev to the edge and start World War III. With that being said, instead of invading, the US decided to do a blockade. The blockade would intercept all shipments made to Cuba. However, A naval blockade was considered an act of war. In a letter written to Kennedy, Khrushchev claimed that a violation of freedom to use international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression, which pushes mankind toward the abyss of world nuclear missile war. With that, the blockade began a standstill, as both sides waited to see if there would be a world nuclear war. But at the end of the day, the US and Soviet Union were finally able to strike a deal. Back in the US, the deal caused a lot of controversy, because the US agreed to never again invade Cuba, and to also dismantle our nuclear arsenal from Turkey and Italy. However, the United States also got what they wanted. The Soviet Union got rid of the missiles in Cuba, and everyone was able to benefit from the agreement. And while that may be true, the Soviets were seen as retreating from the situation it had originally initiated. This led to criticism of Khrushchev, and was in part responsible for his fall of power 2 years later. And back in the home turf, the United States' lasting consequence was to leave the communist regime in Cuba, which still is going on to this day. I'll let you guys go with this question. What if the United States invaded Cuba? What if they got rid of Castro and prevented communism in the island? If the United States decided to invade, instead of taking Tommy Thompson's advice to blockade, would we have seen another world war?
With that being said, here's our video review questions. Question 1. The Soviets claimed that they planted missiles in Cuba because the US had missiles where? The answer, Turkey and Italy. Question 2. Who recommended the US not to invade Cuba because it could have caused a world war? The answer, former foreign ambassador to Moscow, Tommy Thompson. Question 3. What president put together the Bay of Pigs? The answer, Dwight Eisenhower. Question 4. What type of government overthrew Batista? The answer, the revolutionary communist guerrilla of Fidel Castro. Question 5. What does MAD stand for? The answer, Mutual Assured Destruction. And lastly, question 6. What does ICBM stand for? The answer, Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles. Thank you guys for watching. If you could do us a favor and subscribe, and hit the like button, we'd really appreciate you. Thank you for watching today's video, and stay safe.